Welcome to Discover Truth. My name is garethgw, and today, once again, we're going to open up our Bibles to the book of Esther in the Old Testament, and we're going to carry on through our story there. Remember, Esther has now just become queen. Vashti has been put out of the kingdom, and God has organized all of the fine detail so that an ordinary person, a young Jewess, remember that was her secret, a young Jewess called Esther, had now become the queen over the land of Persia. I wonder for what purpose or for what reason. Today we're going to discover that it's not always easy to live as God's child. Let's listen carefully and see what God is going to teach us and how He's going to instruct us today. Have you ever kept a journal or wrote a diary? Sometimes it can be fun after a number of years to bring out those diaries and to read back through them, to read about all the adventures that you had and the places that you went and the things that you thought about. Well, back in the days of the story of Esther, King Ahasuerus, well, he didn't exactly keep a diary, but he did have people called scribes who would have wrote down the history of his empire, the history of his kingdom. And maybe sometimes they would have wrote down whenever there was great battles that had been fought and victories won. Maybe they recorded that time whenever King Ahasuerus had that big 6 month festival or party, the celebration, where he invited all of the important people and all the leaders throughout his nation to that. Maybe he had recorded the time whenever Queen Vashti said no to him and he chose to make a public example of her, and he removed the crown from her head and he expelled her from his kingdom, never more to come back into the palace. Maybe he had recorded the events that led up to Queen Esther coming into the palace and her becoming his new bride. But also, if we had read through that history book, we would discover the name of Mordecai. His name too was written in that history book. But why on earth was his name recorded there? Well, our story begins at the end of chapter 2 in the book of Esther. And we see that Mordecai, he was working for the king. He was one of the king's leaders, probably part of his council. And it's called that he actually worked in the king's gate. It doesn't mean that he opened and closed the gate or the doors which led towards the palace. No, that was a job, that was a position. It was a legal position. Almost like the way here in the UK, in our parliament, in our government, we have what's known as the cabinet. It's not a literal cabinet. It's a group of people who work together and form part of the government. That's their role and that's their job. And the name of it is the cabinet. So whenever we read about Mordecai working in the city gate, that's actually a role, it's a position of authority, and he was working there for the king. But while he's sitting and doing his job, just like any other day, he had heard a couple of the king's guards, they were having a conversation. And the things that he overheard were really concerning. These two guards, they were plotting to assassinate, to kill the king. This put Mordecai in an awkward position. I mean, what was he to do? I mean, sure, he could just have ignored what he had heard. He could have let that go in one ear and out the other. Or he could have acted upon it and he could have done something. But any which way, it was going to be a tough decision to make. Same way as a Christian, sometimes it can be hard for you to be a Christian. Sometimes you too have hard decisions to make. Maybe in school, something has happened amongst some of the pupils there. Maybe one little friendship group have written a really nasty, horrible note to somebody else in the class. It made the person who read it so sad and so upset. And whenever the teacher found out, they became so angry, they were cross. They wanted those who had wrote the note to own up and to confess what they had done. but nobody wanted to speak or say anything. They were now a little bit embarrassed or ashamed, and they didn't want to get into any kind of trouble. But the thing is, you knew who was involved in writing that little note. You knew who the ringleaders were. As a Christian, God would want you to step forward and to give the names out of the people who had done the wrong thing, to call them out. But that can be hard, because sometimes you can think, if you call them out, what are those people eventually going to do to you? Maybe you'll lose some friends. Maybe people will make fun of you. Maybe life will be difficult for you. And maybe in that situation, it can be a tough decision to make. But God wants you to do what's right. He wants you to obey Him. He wants you to fulfill His wishes and to fulfill His commands. The same way, maybe whenever you become a new Christian, it's difficult to tell people that you are a Christian. It's difficult to tell people what you believe, that you go to church and Sunday school and children's meetings, that you read the Bible, that you pray, that you believe in God, that you love the Lord Jesus Christ. Maybe you find it difficult to say those things to people. You're a little bit embarrassed. But God, He wants you to be faithful. He wants you to be faithful to His word, be faithful to Him, and to stand up for the truth, for the things that you know to be right. Mordecai was a good example of this, because he knew that what he had heard, it had to be shared with the king. So he done the only thing that he knew how. He took the information to Queen Esther, and Queen Esther in turn took that information to the king. The king, he carried out his own investigations, and as it turns out through his investigations that there were two of these soldiers who worked closely with the king, that they were planning an assassination attempt. Now that had been uncovered, the king had got those two men who were planning to kill the king, and he had them put to death. Normally this type of information would have been written down in the history books, and so they were. This is why Mordecai's name was written in the king's history book. But usually in those days, whenever someone done something nice or kind or good for the king, they usually received honour or praise. But on this occasion, it seemed to be that Mordecai's name was written in the history books, but nothing was done or given to him. It might have been easy for Mordecai to think to himself that this isn't fair. After all that I just done and I saved the king's life, surely the least he could do is show me some kind of respect. The least thing he could do is give me some kind of gift, or he could give me some kind of promotion. But it just so happened that he seemed to have been overlooked. And sometimes that can happen to you as a Christian. Maybe in school you're trying to do what's right. Even within your family, you're doing what's right and what's good, and you're trying to be obedient. You're trying to do your best. It's not very often that people will come along and pat you in the back for doing what's right. Very often that's just what people expect you to do. But God, He wants you to keep on doing what's right and not expect the round of applause, not expect a pat on the back. Just do what's right, because that's the right thing. And it's pleasing to God, and He is the one who takes notice. Just the same way that God, He had taken notice of exactly what Mordecai had done. And God, who is a sovereign, who is in control and who rules over all, He wouldn't let these things go unnoticed and unrewarded. God works out all things for the good of His children. But just at that same time, it seemed to be that the king, he put a new man into a position, second highest position within the kingdom. And this man's name was Haman. And Haman was filled with pride and filled with arrogance. He was a wealthy man, he was an important man, and all of that went to his head. And there he was strutting about around the palace and around the city, showing off his position and his importance. But whenever the king had given him the promotion, the king also made a funny rule that all the people who worked in the king's court around the king's palace, whenever Haman was passing by, they had to bow down to him. So whenever he was walking through the palace gates, there was all the officials and they were bowing down, showing him honour and showing him great respect. And I'm sure this helped to inflate the ego of Haman everywhere he went. But Mordecai, he refused to bow. probably because he was a Jew and he knew the Old Testament, he knew the commandments. And the Bible tells us there that we're not to bow down or to worship anybody else except for the one true living God. So he refused to bow. Maybe he also knew the type of man that Haman was, and he didn't want to show him any respect for the way that he was carrying on. But more so, I think it was because he was a Jew and he wanted to obey God's law and not to bow down to anyone except the one true and living God. Day after day, Haman would have walked through the palace and around the grounds, and people were bowing all around except for Mordecai. Some of the other officials had noticed that Mordecai wasn't bowing, and they went over and began to challenge him as to why he was breaking the king's command and why he was dishonoring Haman and he wasn't doing what was right. Through the course of conversation, it must have came to light that Mordecai had said to them that he was a Jew and he wouldn't worship or bow down to any man except for God. These men, they were annoyed at Mordecai because of the way he was getting on and because he wasn't respecting Haman. So some of them went off and told Haman that there was one man who worked for the king and he wasn't obedient. He wasn't bowing down and he wasn't worshipping him. Haman at this point hadn't actually noticed this was taking place, but now it had been brought to his attention. Every time he walked past where Mordecai was, he became very aware that Mordecai wasn't bowing down to him and he wasn't doing what was right. He had discovered that Mordecai was a Jew, and therefore he thought to himself, I'm going to show these Jews who's important. I'm going to show them what's right. And he came up with a wicked and evil scheme. He planned to get rid of Mordecai and all of the Jews throughout Persia. He planned to have them all put to death. How was he going to work out this evil scheme? How could he get away with something so tragic? Well, he called together some of his wise men, and they got perhaps dice or straws. They were going to try and decide when they were going to carry out their wicked scheme. They thought somehow maybe rolling these dice or drawing these straws was going to show that their false gods were in alignment or in agreement with what he was planning to do. As he rolled his dice or drew the straws, it showed up that there was going to be the 13th day of the 12th month. He was going to carry out his wicked plan. He was going to have all of the Jews through the whole of the empire. He was going to have them all eradicated, have them all put to death. The following day, he went off to the king, and he said to the king, there's a group of people who live throughout your empire, and they have different rules and different laws to you, and they're not obedient to the laws that you have given. Can I make a law to challenge them or to sort them out? The king didn't ask for too many questions or didn't want any more information. Instead, the king trusted Haman and he said to him, look, here's my signet ring. You write whatever law you want to write. Seal it with my ring, and then it'll be fulfilled. It can't be changed, and it can't be revoked, because it'll be written in the law of the Medes and the Persians. It seemed to be that Haman was getting his wicked way. Doesn't it seem in the world that we're living today that people who sin, who go against God, who live their lives whichever way that they please, whatever way they want, doesn't it seem like they're always the people who advance very well in life, who get all the good things, who get promotions, who get recognition? But the thing is, they're sinning directly against God. And though God is merciful and patient, one day their sin will be punished and they will be judged for the wrong things that they have done. Every last one of them. Just the same way that Haman would be judged for every last one of his sins unless he repented of them. Haman, now that he had the king's signet ring, he began to write this law. His law was to destroy and to kill and to wipe out all of the Jews, young and old, on the 13th day of the 12th month and take away all that they own. This law, it was written, it was sealed, it was signed, and it was sealed, most importantly, with the king's signet ring. These laws were copied and they were sent by horseback all throughout the land of Persia. The Jews were going to be destroyed and eradicated on the 13th day of the 12th month. Here was Haman thinking he was getting his wicked way. He was going to get his way over Mordecai. Mordecai the Jew, eventually he was going to die. Little did he know that Esther had a secret. Esther, who was working away in the palace, quietly behind the scenes, she had kept that secret that Mordecai had told her not to tell anyone. She too was a Jewess. How was this law going to affect her? How was this law going to affect the palace? Well, we're going to have to wait until the next part of our lesson to discover how it all unfolds.